She stood in her wedding dress, tears falling, while the groom whispered, "I can't marry a black woman. Not here." When Amara stepped off the dusty train in rural Montana, she held only 2 suitcases, a worn Bible, and a promise of love. But what greeted her wasn't a loving groom. It was shame, silence, and a cruel rejection rooted in her skin. Alone, humiliated, and stranded in a town that didn't want her, she thought her story was over, until a quiet millionaire farmer saw her pain and her worth. Before we continue, if stories of love, strength, and human dignity speak to your heart, please consider subscribing. We tell the tales others forget, the ones that heal, inspire, and remind us that kindness still matters. Join our family, and let's keep hope alive, one story at a time. Amara's heart beat with nervous hope as she stepped onto the wooden platform of the tiny station, her polished boots clicking against the worn boards. The air smelled of dust, smoke, and the faint promise of spring rain. Clutched tightly in her gloved hands was a stack of letters, creased, reread, and cherished. They were from Charles Whitmore, the man who had given her hope when so few others had even given her a second glance. He had painted pictures of a sprawling ranch, sun-drenched fields, and peaceful evenings spent by the fire. But more than that, he had written to her like she mattered, like her words and dreams held weight. He had said, "I seek a good soul, not a color." That sentence had lit a fire in her heart. It had made her believe in the impossible, that love could look past boundaries, past pain, past the harsh lines the world had drawn around her since birth. The moment her foot left the final step of the train, a silence fell around her, not just the quiet of a rural town, but a silence thick with tension. She could feel eyes on her. Too many eyes. Some widened in shock, others narrowed in suspicion. She adjusted her hat with a trembling hand and tried to maintain her poise. She was proud of the way she looked. Her white gloves were clean, her dress pressed, her hair styled neatly beneath her modest bonnet. But still, the stares cut through her like cold wind. Across the street, a small crowd had already begun to form. Mostly men in work clothes, their eyes narrowing as they muttered among themselves. A few women stood behind them, holding onto children, whispering into their bonnets. Amara's grip on her suitcase tightened. And then she saw him. A tall man, lean and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark wool suit and a tan hat. He looked just like the photo he'd sent her, clean-shaven, with sharp cheekbones and kind eyes. But those eyes changed the moment they landed on her. His step faltered. He stopped mid-stride, blinking as if he were seeing something that couldn't be real. She took a hopeful step forward, her heart rising. "Charles?" she asked. He didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice was hushed and brittle. You're Amara?" She smiled gently, extending her hand with all the grace she could muster. "Yes. It's good to finally meet you, Charles." He didn't move. His hands stayed by his side. His mouth opened and closed, then opened again. I didn't know." "You were colored," he said, and the words fell like stones. Amara felt something crack inside her. She stood motionless, her hand still stretched toward him. Behind her, she heard a low murmur spread through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. Charles shook his head slowly, looking around nervously. I can't go through with this." She withdrew her hand, trembling. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The suitcase slid from her grasp and thudded softly against the platform. "But you said—" Her voice broke, and she tried again. "You said you didn't care about color. I didn't think you'd actually—" "Deep," he swallowed hard, eyes darting. "Not here. This town, it's not ready. I just can't." Gasps and hushed voices rose behind her. A man let out a mocking whistle. A child asked too loudly, "Why won't he marry her, Mama?" And a woman hissed, "Come on, let's go before it turns ugly." Amara stood frozen in place. The future she had imagined. The little white house on the prairie, the porch swing, the garden she'd hoped to tend, the man she thought would love her, collapsed like a house built on sand. All that remained was humiliation, standing tall and bare beneath the judgmental eyes of strangers. Charles turned away. Just like that, it was over. She didn't cry, not yet. She picked up her suitcase and walked down the platform, one heavy step at a time. The murmurs followed her, but she didn't look back. Not even when the train behind her pulled away, taking with it the last sense of safety she had known. There was nowhere else to go. No plan B. No welcoming arms waiting for her at the next station. Just the cruel reality of being stranded in a town that had already decided what she was worth and found her lacking. She wandered the main street, passing storefronts where men stepped aside to let her walk past, but not out of politeness. It was fear, disgust, judgment. She tried the boarding house, her hands still shaking as she rang the bell. A pale woman answered and frowned immediately at the sight of her. "I need a room," Amara said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman looked her over, eyes resting far too long on her skin. "We're full." Amara glanced at the vacant window upstairs, curtain half drawn. "I saw the sign. We're full," the woman snapped, slamming the door shut before Amara could finish. She sat on a bench near the church, exhausted. Her gloves were no longer white. Her shoes, once polished, were now covered in dust. She opened her Bible, trying to focus on the words, but seeing only the image of Charles walking away. Every word they'd shared felt like a lie. She remembered writing to him about her mother's passing, how hard life had been after the war, how much she longed for a place where she didn't have to defend her right to exist, and he had written back with such tenderness. "You're strong, Amara. The world's been unfair to you, but I will not be. Come to me, and we'll make our own life." How easily promises melted in the sun. She didn't eat that day. She didn't sleep that night. The church steps became her only refuge, the hard stone beneath her a bitter reminder that there was no soft place left for her in this world. She clutched her Bible like a life raft and whispered prayers into the night. Not for a second chance with Charles, not even for love, but for strength. Strength to not dissolve beneath the weight of rejection and shame. She remembered her mother's voice, soft and firm like a lullaby wrapped in steel. "You are more than what this world says. You come from women who endured. You carry their fire." But that fire tonight felt more like ash. The moon hung above the church like a silent witness, casting long shadows across the empty street. Amara pulled her coat tighter, resting her head against the cool stone wall. She'd thought she'd known pain before, loss, poverty, loneliness, but this was something deeper. This was being unmade, stripped of dignity before people who never even asked her name. She didn't hear the footsteps until they were nearly upon her, a quiet crunch of boots on gravel. She sat up, alarmed. "You shouldn't be out here alone," a voice said. She looked up and saw a man standing before her. Not Charles. Taller, broader. A hat pulled low over his brow. A satchel slung over his shoulder, hands rough and weathered like the land. He didn't approach too quickly, just stood there, letting her see that he meant no harm. She met his gaze, and saw no fear, no pity, just something quiet, something real. "I saw what happened at the station," he said softly. She looked away. "I don't need your sympathy." "I didn't come to offer any," he replied. "Just this." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a blanket. "It gets cold at night." She hesitated, then took it with slow hands. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse, He nodded and started to turn, then paused. "If you need a place to stay." "I've got a spare room in the farmhouse. It's not much, but it's warm." She blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. "You don't even know me." "No," he said. "But I saw enough to know you didn't deserve what happened. Name's Elijah Hart." She studied him, her mind racing. A stranger offering kindness when no one else had. She had every reason not to trust. But there was no trick in his voice, no twitch in his eye. Just a tired man who looked at her like she was human. "I'm Amara," she said finally. He tipped his hat and walked off into the dark, leaving the invitation hanging, in the air like the scent of something warm and fresh on a cold morning. She stared after him, blanket clutched to her chest. It wasn't salvation, but it was a beginning, a flicker of light after a day of darkness. And for the first time since stepping off the train, Amara felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But maybe the shape of it. She looked up at the moon and whispered into the night, "Mama, I'm still standing." The town offered no shelter, no warmth. Amara had knocked on every door that looked even remotely welcoming. Boarding houses, small inns, and even a parlor with a room-to-let sign in the window. But each one had turned her away with the same tight-lipped expression. Some offered a curt "no vacancies," while others didn't bother responding at all. One woman, after letting Amara explain her need for a room, simply closed the door in her face without a word. It wasn't that the rooms were taken. It was that she was the one asking. By sundown, her shoes were scuffed and coated in dust. Her once pristine lace gloves were grimy and torn at the fingertips. Her hands ached from gripping her suitcase for so long. Her dress clung to her legs, damp with sweat and dust from the long walk. She had nowhere left to go and no one left to trust. She ended up at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to stretches of open field and silence. There she found a small chapel, white paint chipping from its sides, a crooked wooden cross leaning gently from the steeple. It looked abandoned but not unloved. Wildflowers had sprouted in the cracks around the steps, and the wooden door stood, slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone in need. Amara didn't go inside. She couldn't bring herself to. Her soul felt too heavy, her body too dirty to sit beneath stained glass and kneel before a God who had watched all this unfold without intervention. So instead, she sat on the steps, setting her suitcase beside her, and pulled her worn Bible from the bag. She held it like a lifeline, not for divine answers, but for the memory of her mother's voice reading its verses at night, whispering faith into her young heart during the darkest of times. The pages rustled in the breeze, but she didn't turn them. She didn't have the strength to read, not now. She sat still as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in smears of orange and deep red. The air cooled, and a hush settled over the town. Distantly, dogs barked. A horse trotted past, on a dirt path behind the church. Somewhere a piano played softly, its tune half-formed and melancholy. And Amara, alone on the steps, whispered a prayer, not for a second chance, not for the man who had walked away, but for the aching inside her chest to stop, for the burning in her throat to subside, for the earth to hold her gently when nothing else would. Darkness came slow but steady. Crickets began to chirp in the tall grass, and shadows stretched long across the field. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay warm, her back pressed against the cool wood of the chapel door. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was sharp and endless, a reminder that she was unseen, unheard, and unwanted in a world that continued to turn without her. And then, out of the quiet, a voice broke through. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Amara flinched, startled, her fingers tightening around the edges of her Bible. She looked up quickly, unsure what to expect, another stranger to judge her, mock her, or worse. But what she saw stopped her breath. A tall man stood at the foot of the steps, The moonlight touched his shoulders, casting his figure in silver light. He was broad-shouldered, with sleeves rolled up to his forearms and boots coated in mud. His face was partially shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could see his eyes, calm, steady, and full of something she hadn't seen all day. Kindness. "I saw what happened at the station," he said, his voice deep and steady, tinged with something almost like sorrow. "I've lived in this town all my life, and I've never felt more ashamed of it." Amara didn't respond. Her throat tightened. Her heart beat fast, not in fear, but in stunned disbelief. She waited for the cruelty to follow, for the baited kindness to turn into something jagged and bitter. But it didn't come. The man took a slow step forward, then reached into the satchel slung over his shoulder. From it, he pulled a folded blanket and held it out to her. "It gets cold at night," he said simply. She hesitated. A day filled with rejection had left her brittle. She didn't want to owe anyone anything, not a favor, not a thank you. But the truth was, she was freezing. Her hands had long since gone numb, and her teeth had begun to chatter softly. She took the blanket from him, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't move away. He didn't intrude either. He just stood nearby, silent. "I'm Amara," she said after a moment. "I know," he replied. "You came for Charles Whitmore." The name hit her like a cold slap, but she nodded. He shifted his weight slightly, looking out toward the field. "My name's Elijah. Hart. I own the land west of town. Maybe you've heard the rumors." She had. The name was familiar. When she'd asked about available suitors months ago, someone had mentioned him in passing. Elijah Hart, the widower with too much land and not enough friends. Strange man. Keeps to himself. Rich but odd. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. He'd never been on her list. His silence now was not the kind that judged. It was the kind that listened. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. He looked down at the steps before answering. "Because no one else did. Because I know what it's like to lose everything you hoped for in a day." Something in his voice cracked slightly, then steadied. "I don't want anything from you," he continued. "You don't owe me conversation. I just couldn't sleep knowing you were out here like this." She believed him. Somehow she believed him. The blanket smelled of cedar and something earthy. It was heavy but warm, and the warmth seeped into her slowly, calming the tremble in her bones. For the first time since stepping off the train, she felt human again, not invisible, not pitied, not feared. Just seen. Elijah glanced at the chapel. "My mother used to come here every Sunday. She'd sing so loud you'd hear her all the way into the fields." He smiled faintly, a memory catching him mid-sentence. "Haven't stepped inside in years, but I figure it's still a good place to find some peace." Amara looked up at him, really looked. The hard lines of his face weren't unfriendly, just weathered by work and grief. His hands, though rough and calloused, hung gently at his sides. He had a sadness about him, but it didn't weigh him down. It made him softer, quieter. "Would you like to come in?" he asked. She hesitated. Then slowly, she stood, gathering her things. He pushed the door open and let her enter first. The chapel inside was dark but dry. Dust floated through moonlight streaming in from the stained glass window. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. Elijah lit a small lantern from the wall, set it on a bench, and stepped back outside, giving her the space to be alone. Amara sat on the pew nearest the altar and exhaled deeply. For the first time all day, she felt safe. She would never forget what Charles had done to her. The betrayal cut too deep. But tonight, beneath the quiet gaze of a stranger with calloused hands and kind eyes, something shifted. Maybe this town hadn't welcomed her. But maybe, just maybe, not everyone in it had forgotten how to be human. Elijah had offered her a place to stay, just for a night, he'd said, his voice careful, as if afraid to scare her off. His cabin stood on the edge of a sprawling wheat field, tucked against a grove of sycamore trees that whispered in the wind. It was small but solid, with windows that caught the sunrise and floors that creaked with memory. That night, Amara slept, on a cot by the fire, the scent of fresh wood and dried herbs lulling her into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in days. One night became 2, and then a week. Before either of them could define it, the days began folding into each other like pages in a book neither wanted to finish. Amara began to help with chores in the kitchen, mending shirts, tending the garden. But Elijah, he had other ideas. He taught her to drive a plow, to recognize the weight of the soil before rain, and to watch the sky for signs only a farmer would know. She had never known land like this, had never felt the weight of purpose that came from coaxing something from the earth with your own 2 hands. He shed more than just land. He brought her books, yellowed and worn at the edges, full of poems and philosophies he rarely spoke aloud but read often. They'd sit on the porch in the late evenings, the day's work behind them, sipping sweet tea and reading quietly side by side. Some nights they'd talk, about nothing, about everything, about their childhoods, their mothers, their favorite seasons. But they never spoke of the train platform again. It lingered between them, but not like a wound, more like a thread of truth that no longer needed to be named. She knew, and he knew. That was enough. Their days became a rhythm. Morning coffee brewed strong, steam rising in the chill air. Afternoons spent with sleeves rolled up and dirt under their nails. Evenings full of small laughter and the casual closeness of 2 people no longer wary of touching hands or brushing shoulders. Elijah's silence no longer felt heavy. It felt sacred. One golden afternoon, just as the season began to shift and the air carried the crisp scent of harvest, Amara sat on the porch wrapped in a shawl, a book open in her lap. The wind tugged gently at the corners of the pages. She didn't hear Elijah approach, he was always quiet like that. But she felt his presence. He stood by the steps for a long moment watching her. "I don't want you to leave," he said finally. She looked up, startled, the sunlight catching the amber flecks in her eyes. "Not because I pity you," he continued, his voice shaking slightly, "but because I see you, and I love what I see." The words settled in her chest with a warmth that spread outward like firelight. She blinked, and tears came, not the ones she'd swallowed back on the train platform, not the tears of humiliation or fear, but the kind that came when something lost had finally been found. They married. Not long after, in the same chapel where she had once wept alone beneath the moon. The wildflowers had grown taller since then, and the pews were still dusted with age. The townsfolk came, though many kept their distance, their curiosity flickering behind polite nods and whispered words. But Elijah never wavered. He held her, hand the entire time, never once letting it go. And she? She stood tall, shoulders straight, eyes forward, not because the whispers had stopped, but because they no longer held power. She had found something stronger than acceptance. She had found love. Love that didn't ask her to change or explain or apologize for being exactly who she was. She moved through his home like sunlight. She planted flowers near the window and hung linens that caught the breeze. The fields, once quiet and obedient, seemed to bloom more wildly under her care. Elijah often said the wheat grew taller since she came, and she'd just smile and shake her head. But in her heart, she believed it too. Something had shifted in the earth, just as it had in them. To him, she was never a mail-order bride. She was never a compromise or a mistake. She was never the woman someone else had rejected. She was the miracle that turned his quiet, lonesome farm into a place of song and color. She was the one who knelt by his fields and whispered thanks to the wind. She was the woman who had survived sorrow and still chose to offer joy. In his eyes, she was never less than divine, and in the warmth of their home, surrounded by wheat that bent toward the sun and skies that stretched wide with promise, she no longer felt like a woman who had once been turned away. She was the heart of it all. The reason the harvest was richer, the reason silence had given way to laughter, she was simply loved.